The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Oak Ridge Estates as I sat on my front porch, coffee in hand. After 20 years in tactical law enforcement, retirement should have felt peaceful. Instead, I found myself cataloging threats in what should have been a safe neighborhood. The threat was not criminals or outside dangers, but something more insidious that had been growing right here on these manicured streets. They called themselves the HOA Enforcement Team, though I had found no legal record of our neighborhood having a registered homeowners association. Every Tuesday and Saturday, like clockwork, they patrolled the streets in matching navy polos with unofficial badges pinned to their chests. They carried clipboards and measuring tools, documenting what they deemed violations of rules no one had agreed to follow. I watched as Corinne Michaels, their self-appointed leader, stopped at the house across the street. The owner, a young father named David, had left his son's bicycle in the driveway overnight. From my vantage point, I could see her gesturing emphatically, pointing at the offending item while David looked increasingly uncomfortable. Her voice carried across the quiet morning air. "This is your third violation this month," she declared loudly enough for the whole street to hear. "The fine has increased to $150, payable immediately. If you continue to disregard community standards, we will have no choice but to place a lien on your property." The absurdity of the threat might have been amusing if it were not so effective. David apologized and promised to pay, clearly intimidated despite having done nothing wrong. This scene had been repeating itself throughout the neighborhood for months. Elderly residents were reduced to tears over grass height. A single mother received daily notices about her trash can placement. A veteran with PTSD was harassed about his flag display. My own interactions with the group had started 3 weeks after moving in. Corinne and 2 of her enforcers had approached while I was installing a security camera on my front porch. She informed me that all exterior modifications required prior approval. When I asked to see the official HOA documentation, she merely pointed to a binder and claimed it contained all the necessary authority. "I will need to see the legally filed HOA documents," I had insisted calmly. "Everyone in this neighborhood understands how things work," she replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "We maintain standards here. You will too, or face consequences." That confrontation had been followed by weekly notices for increasingly trivial issues. My grass was too green, suggesting excessive water usage. My garbage can had been visible from the street for 15 minutes too long. My American flag was displayed incorrectly. Each notice came with arbitrary fines and threats. As I watched David carry his son's bicycle into his garage, my phone vibrated with a message from my old colleague Rodriguez. He confirmed that he and 10 other former tactical officers could make it for the SWAT training course I had proposed. Originally intended as a skills refresher for veterans and active officers, the course would transform my backyard into a professional training ground for the weekend. I texted back my confirmation as Corinne glanced toward my house, making a note on her clipboard. Something told me these self-appointed neighborhood tyrants would not approve of my weekend plans. A slight smile crossed my face as I realized the timing could not have been more perfect. Perhaps it was time for a lesson about real versus imagined authority. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was returning from a run when I spotted 3 HOA enforcers surrounding Mrs. Mitchell in her front yard. At 82 years old, the widow could barely manage her yard work, yet she tried faithfully to maintain her modest home. Now she stood trembling as Corinne and 2 men towered over her, demanding immediate payment for alleged violations. "Your hedges exceed the 36-inch height limit by nearly 4 inches, Corinne stated, measuring tape extended as evidence. And these weeds in your flower bed constitute a separate violation. That will be $200 due immediately, or we will be forced to take further action." Mrs. Mitchell clutched her gardening gloves to her chest. "I do not have that kind of money right now. My Social Security check does not come until next week." "Rules are rules," insisted one of the men, a stocky individual named Greg who worked as a real estate agent. "Perhaps you should consider if this neighborhood is still suitable for someone in your situation." That was enough. I crossed the street and positioned myself beside Mrs. Mitchell, my military-bearing automatic after years of service. "Is there a problem here?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well what was happening. Karen straightened her polo shirt, badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "This is HOA business. We are addressing serious violations on this property." "Mrs. Mitchell has lived in this home for 42 years, I replied evenly. "That is considerably longer than any homeowners association has existed here. May I see the legal documentation authorizing you to collect these fines?" The confrontation escalated as Corinne insisted they had authority through neighborhood covenant agreements. When I requested to see these documents, she claimed they were on file with the county. That evening, I drove to the county record's office and discovered the truth. No homeowners association had ever been properly registered for our neighborhood. The collection of fines without legal authority constituted fraud. Armed with this information, I requested an emergency community meeting through the neighborhood's social media page. 20 concerned residents gathered in the local library, meeting room 2 days later. I presented my findings clearly, showing the legal requirements for establishing an HOA and proving none had been met. "What you have been paying are unauthorized fines to individuals with no legal authority," I explained to the shocked group. "This constitutes fraud and possibly extortion." Corinne and her enforcers attended the meeting as well, seated in the back row with stern expressions. When given the opportunity to respond, she dismissed my concerns as technical details and insisted their authority came from community standards everyone agreed to when moving here. Several board members who had connections to local development companies backed her claims. It became clear that legitimate concerns would be dismissed by those benefiting from the arrangement. The meeting ended with nothing resolved. The following morning, I returned home from grocery shopping to find an official-looking notice pinned to my door. It threatened property liens and legal action for continued defiance of community standards, and specifically noted unauthorized structures being assembled on the property, despite no construction having begun. That evening, as I finalized the schedule for the tactical training exercise planned for the weekend, I recognized that the timing could not have been more perfect. The backyard training course would serve two purposes now, not just skills maintenance for my former colleagues, but an opportunity to stand firm against those who abuse power through the guise of authority. I confirmed the final details with Rodriguez, feeling more certain than ever that this confrontation needed to happen. The preparation unfolded with military precision beginning 3 days before the scheduled training. My first call went to Rodriguez, now a SWAT commander for the neighboring county sheriff's department. His immediate enthusiasm confirmed what I already knew: professional officers craved realistic training opportunities. "Count me in, James," he said, his voice carrying the same confidence I remembered from our years working together. "I can bring 4 of my current team members too. They could use the experience." One by one, I contacted former colleagues now spread across various law enforcement agencies. Major Thompson had served 3 tours overseas with special forces before joining our tactical unit. He now trained federal agents and immediately offered to participate. Been too long since we ran drills together. I will bring some of my training equipment. Jacobson, a tactical instructor at the police academy, committed himself and 2 senior cadets. They need to see how professionals operate outside the controlled environment of the academy, he explained. By Wednesday evening, 12 experienced professionals had confirmed their participation. These were not weekend warriors playing soldier games. These were men and women who had served their communities in the highest stress environments imaginable: hostage situations, active shooter scenarios, terrorist threats. Each brought specialized expertise that would make the training valuable for everyone involved. Thursday morning, I transformed my backyard into a professional training ground. The half-acre space behind my home offered perfect conditions for our purpose. I erected temporary barriers using plywood sheets and sandbags to create room-clearing scenarios. Communication equipment was tested and calibrated. Training stations were established for different tactical movements and approaches. The focus would be a complex hostage negotiation scenario requiring quick decision-making and precise coordination, skills that deteriorate without regular practice. Every detail was planned with safety as the absolute priority. Training weapons with distinctive bright orange markings would be used. Clear boundaries were established with safety zones clearly marked. I personally visited the neighbors whose properties directly adjoined mine to notify them about the weekend exercise. Most were supportive, particularly after months of frustration with the self-appointed HOA enforcers. Mrs. Carson, next door, even offered her garden as an observation point if needed. By Friday afternoon, equipment bags filled with tactical gear began arriving. Body armor vests, communication headsets, training weapons that matched the weight and feel of service weapons but could fire only specialized training rounds, movement sensors to evaluate entry techniques, recording equipment to review performance afterward. I inspected each item methodically, placing them in the garage in organized rows. The precision of the preparation was calming, a return to the structured world I had known for so many years. This was legitimate authority in action, careful, professional, and focused on public safety rather than power or control. As I finished inventory, my phone vibrated with a text message from Jamie, the teenage son of my neighbor across the street. The 17-year-old had developed an interest in law enforcement careers, and we had spoken several times about his options after graduation. Mr. Wilson, thought you should know. Overheard Corinne and Greg talking outside our house. They're planning a surprise inspection of your property tomorrow. Something about unauthorized structures in your backyard. They mentioned bringing the whole team early afternoon. I thanked him for the information, a plan forming immediately. Rather than confronting them beforehand or rescheduling the exercise, this presented an opportunity for a more effective lesson. If the self-proclaimed authorities insisted on trespassing onto private property without permission or notice, perhaps experiencing the consequences of such actions would be educational. I texted Rodriguez with the new information. His response was immediate, perfect timing. Let them come. Sometimes the best lessons are learned through experience. That night, I finalized every detail of the exercise with the timing in mind. The training would begin early, allowing the team to be fully engaged in realistic scenarios by early afternoon when our uninvited guests were likely to arrive. I placed my folder of county records and evidence of the fraudulent HOA activities on my desk, ready if needed. As I checked the weather forecast one final time, clear skies predicted for tomorrow, I felt strangely at peace. Sometimes confrontation is necessary when dealing with bullies. The difference between intimidation and legitimate authority would soon become abundantly clear to everyone in Oak Ridge Estates. Dawn broke with the quiet efficiency of professionals at work. The first vehicle arrived precisely at 6:00 a.m., Rodriguez in his personal truck, dressed in black tactical pants and a gray t-shirt. He carried 2 equipment bags with practiced ease, his movements economical and precise. We exchanged a brief nod as he set his gear in the designated area. "Just like old times," he commented, surveying the backyard setup with an appreciative eye. "You have not lost your touch for designing realistic scenarios." The others arrived in quick succession over the next 30 minutes. SUVs and trucks pulled into my driveway and along the street, carrying men and women who moved with the unmistakable presence of those who had served in high-stress environments. There was minimal conversation as equipment was unloaded and carried to the backyard staging area. Major Thompson arrived with 3 colleagues from Federal Service, bringing specialized communication equipment that would enhance our training capabilities. Jacobson and his Academy cadets brought professional recording devices to document techniques for later review. Everyone moved with purpose, the morning light strengthening as tactical vests, communication headsets, and training equipment were distributed. Young Jamie from next door arrived as invited, his eyes wide with excitement at the gathering of professionals. I had asked him to serve as our lookout, positioned at the front of the property, with instructions to text a simple message when certain vehicles appeared. He took the responsibility seriously, positioning himself on his front porch with a clear view of the street. By 7:30 a.m., all participants had assembled in my garage for the morning briefing. Maps of the training area were displayed on a large board, with exercise zones clearly marked. I outlined the hostage negotiation scenario we would be practicing, emphasizing safety protocols and communication procedures. Then I explained the secondary purpose of today's exercise, the neighborhood situation that had been escalating. "We have reason to believe we may have uninvited visitors this afternoon," I explained. "Self-appointed HOA enforcers who have been operating fraudulently in this neighborhood." Heads nodded in understanding. Each had witnessed similar abuses of power in their careers. Thompson shared a story about a corrupt small-town police chief who operated similarly until federal investigation shut down his operation. He was collecting public safety fees from local businesses with no legal authority. Rodriguez described HOA harassment in his own community that ended in court. They tried to force an elderly couple out of their home over a rose garden that violated no actual regulations. Judge ordered them to pay damages. The camaraderie deepened as they recognized this training served multiple purposes. "If they arrive during our exercise," I explained, "we continue as planned. No confrontation, no aggression. We simply maintain our positions and let legitimate authority speak for itself." By mid-morning, the exercises were in full swing. The team divided into 3 groups rotating through different scenarios. One practiced room-clearing techniques using the temporary structures in the backyard. Another worked on negotiation strategies for hostage situations. The third focused on tactical communication during high-stress scenarios. The property came alive with controlled movement and professional execution of maneuvers. Commands were issued in clear, measured tones. Team members moved with synchronized precision, developed through years of training and real-world experience. This was not play acting or weekend warriors. This was professional development at its finest. From my position overseeing the exercises, I could see Jamie maintaining his lookout with diligence. He had positioned himself with a book as cover for his surveillance, occasionally looking up to scan the street before returning to his reading. The teenager showed promising observation skills that would serve him well if he pursued his interest in law enforcement. As noon approached, we took a brief break for hydration and scenario adjustments. Rodriguez approached me with a tactical suggestion for the afternoon exercises. Let us increase the difficulty level for the extraction scenario. These people are performing better than I expected. I agreed, making notations on the exercise plan. The team gathered around a folding table with water bottles and energy bars, discussing techniques and sharing experiences from their various agencies. The atmosphere was focused but relaxed, professionals at work among peers who understood the importance of their skills. None of us realized that our audience would be arriving sooner than expected. The team immersed themselves completely in the scenarios, unaware that the confrontation we had anticipated was about to unfold. The text from Jamie arrived during a particularly intense hostage negotiation scenario. Eagle has landed, 4 of them coming up the driveway. Karen, Greg, Linda, and some guy I have not seen before. I caught Rodriguez's eye across the training area and gave him a subtle nod, our prearranged signal to continue rather than pause the exercise. He understood immediately, directing his team to proceed with the complex extraction maneuver they had been practicing. Their movements intensified, communication becoming more focused and precise as they executed the scenario. Thompson's team maintained their positions at the perimeter, securing the training area as they had been throughout the morning. Jacobson and his academy cadets continued their documentation of techniques, cameras recording the professional execution of tactical maneuvers. To an outside observer, it would appear as a seamless, coordinated operation, exactly as intended. I positioned myself near the side gate where our uninvited visitors would likely enter, continuing to observe and direct the exercise while awaiting the inevitable interruption. The training weapons remained clearly visible with their bright orange markings, safety protocols in full effect despite the coming confrontation. The gate to the backyard swung open without warning or permission. 4 figures in matching navy blue polo shirts emblazoned with unofficial HOA logos strode in with the confidence of those accustomed to compliance. Karen led the group, clipboard clutched in one hand, a measuring tape in the other. Greg followed closely behind, with Linda and an unfamiliar man completing their unauthorized entry onto private property. Their expressions transformed in unison from smug authority to stunned disbelief as they took in the scene before them. 12 professionals in tactical gear moved with practiced precision around sophisticated training equipment. Communication headsets crackled with commands. Training weapons were visible throughout the scenario. Karen froze mid-stride as Thompson's team swung around, training weapons instinctively aimed at the unexpected intrusion before quickly identifying them as civilians and adjusting their stance accordingly. The yard fell silent except for the crackling of radio communication as exercises paused naturally in response to the boundary breach. The clipboard Karen clutched now pressed against her chest like a shield. Greg took an involuntary step backward. Linda's mouth opened slightly in shock. The 4th man looked as though he might turn and run at any moment. I calmly removed my tactical helmet and approached the uninvited visitors, my movement deliberate and measured. 20 years of command experience were evident in my stance and tone as I addressed them. You are currently trespassing on private property during a restricted training exercise, I stated evenly. May I ask what authority you believe gives you the right to enter my property without permission or notice? Behind me, my colleagues maintained their positions, the unspoken power of their presence creating an unmistakable contrast to the paper authority of the now visibly uncomfortable HOA representatives. The tableau could not have been more perfect if we had planned it. Legitimate professionals facing self-appointed authoritarians who had overstepped their boundaries. Karen attempted to regain her composure, though her voice wavered noticeably. We are the Homeowners Association enforcement team conducting a compliance inspection. We have received reports of unauthorized structures on this property. I see, I replied calmly. And you believe the appropriate response was to enter private property without permission, notice, or legal authority, during what is clearly a restricted professional training exercise. Greg stepped forward, attempting to project confidence he clearly did not feel. We have every right to inspect properties for compliance with neighborhood standards. Rodriguez approached slowly, standing at my side in silent support. Thompson maintained his position with his team, professional and alert without being threatening. The contrast between real training and pretend authority grew more pronounced with each passing moment. What you are describing would require a legally established homeowners association with properly filed covenants and bylaws, I explained. As I believe you are aware, no such legal entity exists for this neighborhood. Karen's face flushed with anger or embarrassment, possibly both. We have maintained community standards here for years. Everyone understands how things work in Oak Ridge Estates. Intimidation is not the same as authority, I replied evenly. And trespassing remains illegal regardless of your clipboard and matching shirts. The fourth man, whom I did not recognize, began edging toward the gate. Linda looked increasingly uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Karen and the tactical professionals positioned throughout my backyard. Greg's attempt at maintaining an authoritative stance was undermined by the visible sweat appearing on his forehead, despite the mild temperature. I suggest we continue this conversation in the front yard, I offered reasonably. My colleagues need to resume their certified training exercises, and this area is restricted for safety reasons. Without waiting for their response, I gestured toward the gate. The implication was clear. They were neither welcome nor in control of this situation. Their options had narrowed significantly, and the power dynamic had shifted completely. As they reluctantly moved toward the exit, the self-appointed enforcers were about to discover that real accountability had finally arrived in Oak Ridge Estates. The confrontation moved to my front yard, where the contrast between legitimate and false authority became even more apparent. Karen attempted to regain her composure as we faced each other on the lawn, the HOA enforcers now standing uncomfortably before me. Behind them, several neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the unusual sight of the enforcement team being confronted rather than doing the confronting. Karen brandished her folder of alleged violations, her voice still carrying a forced authority. Your property has multiple violations of community standards. These unauthorized structures in your backyard must be removed immediately. Additionally, this gathering exceeds the permitted number of visitors without prior approval. I would like to see the legal documentation authorizing you to make these demands, I replied calmly. Specifically, the properly filed HOA covenants registered with the county. Greg stepped forward. Everyone in this neighborhood understands the standards. Your continued defiance disrupts community harmony. The standoff intensified when Rodriguez approached from the yard, his county police badge now visible on a chain around his neck. I am Commander Rodriguez with the County Sheriff's Department SWAT Division. I am off duty and participating in a sanctioned training exercise with other law enforcement professionals. Karen's clipboard lowered slightly as Rodriguez continued. May I ask what legal authority you have to enter private property without permission or warrant? The question hung in the air as one by one, other team members emerged from the backyard to stand nearby. Thompson introduced himself as a federal tactical instructor. Jacobson identified himself as a police academy training officer. Each introduction drove home the reality of their situation. They were surrounded by legitimate authority figures who understood the law intimately. "This is just a neighborhood matter," Linda offered weakly, her first words since their arrival. I produced a folder of my own containing the documents I had prepared. These are county records proving that no homeowners association has ever been properly registered for Oak Ridge Estates. These are copies of unauthorized fines you have collected from neighbors without legal authority. And these are statements from residents who have been intimidated into payments for alleged violations of rules that have no legal standing. The color drained from Corinne's face as she realized the thoroughness of my investigation. Greg took another step back, creating distance between himself and Corinne. The fourth man, still unidentified, was now openly moving toward his vehicle parked on the street. "What you have been doing," I explained with the calm certainty of someone who understands the law intimately, "constitutes fraud, extortion, and impersonation of officials. Collecting money through intimidation without legal authority is a serious offense." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Several neighbors who had gathered nodded in agreement, emboldened by the confrontation they were witnessing. Mrs. Mitchell stood at the edge of her property, watching with evident satisfaction. "We have only been trying to maintain standards," Corinne insisted, though her voice had lost its commanding tone. "Property values depend on consistent enforcement." "Standards can be maintained legally," I replied, "through properly established associations with transparent rules and democratic processes. What you have created is neither legal nor legitimate." Greg and Linda had now fully distanced themselves from Corinne, moving several steps away as though proximity might imply greater culpability. The fourth man had reached his car and was quickly entering it without looking back. Rodriguez stepped forward again. "As an officer of the law, I feel obligated to inform you that continuing to collect unauthorized payments after being made aware of the illegality could elevate these actions from civil to criminal matters." I offered a choice that sounded reasonable but left no doubt about the seriousness of their situation. "Here is what happens next. You will discontinue all illegitimate HOA activities immediately. You will return all unauthorized funds collected from residents. You will cease entering private property without permission. And you will stop impersonating officials with your badges and threats." Corinne clutched her clipboard tightly, her authority crumbling visibly. "And if we refuse?" "Then I will assist my neighbors in filing formal complaints with the county prosecutor," I replied evenly. "The evidence has been compiled. The witnesses are ready to testify, and you now stand surrounded by law enforcement professionals who understand exactly how the system works." The message was received with stunned silence. The neighborhood tyrants were facing something entirely unfamiliar: legitimate accountability, from people who could not be intimidated by clipboards and empty threats. The retreat was neither graceful nor dignified. Corinne turned without another word and walked stiffly toward her vehicle, clipboard still clutched to her chest like armor that had failed to protect her. Greg and Linda followed at a distance, heads slightly bowed, avoiding eye contact with the gathering neighbors who watched their departure with evident satisfaction. As their vehicles pulled away from the curb, a spontaneous applause broke out among the residents who had witnessed the confrontation. Mrs. Mitchell approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, her relief apparent in every line of her face. The team returned to their training with renewed energy, the exercise now carrying additional significance. Rodriguez clapped me on the shoulder as we walked back to the yard. "Just like old times," he commented, "protecting the community, one operation at a time." By evening, as the training course concluded successfully, news had traveled through the entire neighborhood. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from residents sharing their own experiences of intimidation. Many expressed relief that someone had finally stood up to the self-appointed authorities. Others asked questions about forming a legitimate homeowners association with proper legal standing. As darkness fell, an impromptu gathering formed on my front lawn. Neighbors arrived with lawn chairs and refreshments, exchanging stories they had been too intimidated to share previously. David from across the street admitted he had paid over $500 in unauthorized fines for alleged violations. An elderly couple confessed they had been considering selling their home of 30 years because of the constant harassment. "What should we do now?" asked Mrs. Carson from next door. "We do need some community standards, but not like that." "We form a legitimate association," I explained. "With proper registration, transparent rules, democratic elections, and reasonable processes. The purpose should be community improvement, not control and intimidation." The following weeks brought systematic change to Oak Ridge Estates. With my guidance, residents filed formal complaints with county officials, triggering investigations into the fraudulent collection of fines. I helped neighbors establish a legitimate homeowners association with bylaws drafted by a proper attorney and registered correctly with the county. Karen and her enforcers faced appropriate consequences. The county prosecutor filed charges against Karen for fraud and impersonating officials. Greg and Linda cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced consequences, revealing a scheme that had collected over $40,000 in unauthorized fines over 3 years. Most importantly, the community transformed as fear gave way to cooperation. At the first official HOA meeting, with properly elected officials, neighbors voted to establish assistance programs for elderly residents like Mrs. Mitchell. Volunteers organized weekend yard work sessions for those who needed help maintaining their properties. 3 months after the confrontation, I received a letter from Jamie, the teenager who had served as our lookout that day. He had been accepted to the criminal justice program at the state university and thanked me for inspiring his career path. "I learned more about real authority that day than in all my years of school," he wrote. 6 months later, as summer returned to Oak Ridge Estates, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in the same backyard that had witnessed the confrontation. The temporary training structures had been replaced by picnic tables and play areas for children. Neighbors mingled comfortably, the atmosphere relaxed and genuinely friendly. Rodriguez attended with his family, now a welcome visitor rather than an emergency responder. As we stood watching the community enjoy the evening, he asked the question that had probably been on many minds. "Do you miss it? The tactical work, the high-stakes operations?" I considered the question while observing the transformed neighborhood around me. Children played freely between yards that no longer seemed divided by invisible boundaries of fear. Elderly residents chatted with young families, the generational divide bridged by shared community spirit. "This was the most important operation of my career," I replied honestly, teaching the difference between intimidation and real authority. As the sun set over Oak Ridge Estates, I reflected on what we had accomplished. True power, I realized, comes not from badges or threats or clipboards, but from bringing people together against injustice. It was a lesson far more valuable than any tactical maneuver I could have taught. Real authority serves the community. It does not prey upon it. And sometimes, standing firm against bullies is the most important service anyone can provide.